The most important in history is ideas, especially those ideas which move mankind forward, which are ideas which make the life of generations to come more human. For me, the biggest crime what happened to my husband is not that he was innocently in jail. And, I'm not saying it was not a hard time, because it was. But the lack of the ability to have important ideas govern history, that is the biggest crime. And Lynn, while he was incredibly courageous of producing creative work when he was in prison, he did more in prison than any of us outside, and he put us to shame. But nevertheless, I will only give you one example. In 1989, he was already in jail for nearly 1 year when the borders of Europe opened. He, from his prison cell, designed a great vision how to integrate Eastern Europe, Western Europe, China, the whole Eurasian continent, which would have been a groundbreaking conception which would have put the entire history of the 20th century on a totally new basis. Because economically, to integrate that economic space as one, would have given opportunities and freedom to the states of the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and the Asian countries. But because Lynn was in jail, this idea did not become as effective as if he would have been free. Now, I'm saying this because, to put a man of great ideas into jail is a crime all by itself because of the ideas. The reason why we were able to mobilize hundreds of parliamentarians and thousands of VIPs from around the globe, why would people from Africa sign the parole request for Lyndon LaRouche? Why would people from Latin America do this? Why would people from around the world, from Russia, why would people come out of completely different cultural worlds to fight for this man? Well, because we not only said this man must be free and his innocence must be proven, but many of them told me and others that they understand that the kind of change in global policy my husband is standing for, the kind of just new world economic order which allows the economic development of Africa, which allows the economic development of the developing countries of Eastern Europe, they say is the only hope for them, for their nation, as far away as it may be. So the reason why we must win is not because it's a personal affair. But as my husband was saying, we are going into a period of crisis which most people are completely unaware of. The kinds of changes have to be big, and they have to be done with the help of the United States, because the world cannot be saved against the United States. So it is a historical necessity, and I think that in a certain sense, given the experience I have from 8 years of fighting this, given the fact that more and more people around the globe are united around this and understand that mankind is really sitting in one boat this time, that either we solve all our problems at once or nobody will live, I think we can win, and I think we must have that attitude.
On August 31st and September 1st, 1995, a series of extraordinary hearings were convened in Tysons Corner, Virginia, to investigate gross misconduct by the U.S. Department of Justice. The hearings were chaired by former U.S. Congressman James Mann of South Carolina and J.L. Chestnut of Alabama, the great lawyer and icon of the civil rights movement. The hearings focused on abuses by the U.S. Department of Justice, highlighting the onslaught of targeted criminal cases against black elected officials in the United States, dubbed Operation Frumention, according to FBI whistleblowers and Congressman Merv Dimely of California, as well as the case of Lyndon LaRouche.
My case may be, as Ramsey Clark described it, the most extensive and the highest level of these cases, in terms of the duration and scope of the operation.
Witnesses included LaRouche's attorney, Odin Anderson, Former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark, who had been LaRouche's defense attorney in his appeal, Lyndon LaRouche's wife, Helga LaRouche, from whom you just heard, and Lyndon LaRouche himself. The panel was comprised of leading national and international political figures, including the former Vice Premier of Slovakia, Josef Mikloško, numerous state senators and other elected officials from across the United States, as well as core bishop of the Maronite Church, Monsignor Elias L. Hayek. Numerous international observers were present, including legendary civil rights heroine Amelia Boynton Robinson of Selma, Alabama. As you will hear, these hearings demonstrated not just the injustice which was perpetrated against leading U.S. political officials by the Department of Justice because of their political views, exemplified by the case of Lyndon LaRouche, but the inherent danger at that time that such abuses, if left unchecked, could subsequently threaten the very existence of our constitutional republic itself, a fight we see playing out today, as we speak, at the very highest level of our government in the form of the attempted takedown of the U.S. presidency.
The raid command post about 3 miles from town was busy all night. Just before dawn, Virginia State Police moved out. It was a combined strike force, including FBI, Internal Revenue Service, Secret Service, and other federal and state agents. As FBI agents approached LaRouche's estate in Leesburg, Virginia, 50 miles from Washington, police lined up outside.
Good evening. Federal and state agents today raided the Leesburg, Virginia headquarters of political activist Lyndon LaRouche.
And today it was a law enforcement assault here in Leesburg that set this town buzzing.
Scores of state and local police joined federal agents in a coordinated nationwide raid.
On October 6, 1986, 400 FBI, state police, IRS, ATF agents, and the national news media descended on Leesburg, Virginia, to search offices associated with the LaRouche political movement. At a farm outside Leesburg, where Lyndon and Helga LaRouche were staying, heavily armed agents dressed in full tactical gear patrolled the perimeter as armored personnel carriers surrounded the property and helicopters buzzed constantly overhead. In addition to the materials specified in the federal search warrant, according to later court testimony, the FBI case agent in charge was searching for evidence by which to obtain an arrest warrant for Lyndon LaRouche himself and a search warrant to allow armed entry to the farm. A plan was in place to provoke a firefight with LaRouche's security guards to take out LaRouche, which was admitted years later.
In a fortified estate outside Leesburg.
During the evening of October 6th, moves to implement that plan seemed to begin with news stations broadcasting that now an assault was about to occur on the farm. A telegram was sent in LaRouche's name to President Ronald Reagan, seeking his intervention to call off the raid. Coincidentally, at exactly the same time, President Reagan was in Reykjavik, Iceland, refusing to back down in negotiations with Mikhail Gorbachev on his commitment to the so-called SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, the same SDI that Lyndon LaRouche had worked for years alongside top officials in the Reagan administration to craft and support.
A first generation of strategic ballistic missile defense.
Only after this telegram to Ronald Reagan was sent did the forces surrounding the farm begin to dissipate and recede. However, this was merely the opening chapter in a concerted campaign involving elements within the Justice Department to target and dismantle the political operation of Lyndon LaRouche, a campaign which astute observers of this case would readily compare to the operation underway today against none other than President Donald J. Trump. There are striking similarities between the LaRouche case and the present attempt to prosecute or impeach Donald Trump. The first one is that both cases started with a British call for prosecution and criminal investigation, In LaRouche's case, British intelligence sent a letter to the FBI in 1982 demanding investigation because LaRouche, the British claimed, was an agent of Soviet disinformation. At the same time, Henry Kissinger and the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board triggered a counterintelligence investigation of LaRouche under Executive Order 12333. In the Trump case, the British government began demanding Trump's head as early as 2015 and have bragged to The Guardian and other British newspapers that their spying was the origin of Russiagate. Both cases shared a legal hitman in the form of prosecutor Robert Mueller, and both cases involve the employment of the criminal law enforcement and intelligence capacities of the United States to defeat and silence a political opponent for political reasons, something which violates the very core principles of the U.S. Constitution. In LaRouche's case, the effort was to permanently demonize him in order to bury his ideas, precisely as Helga LaRouche stated in her testimony. As can be seen, the failure to challenge the gross abuses of justice perpetrated by the Justice Department in the case of Lyndon LaRouche has now brought us to the point where the very constitutional system on which our republic depends is being threatened.
All right, the session will come to order.
Let's hear from Lyndon LaRouche's lawyer, Mr. Odin Anderson of Boston, Massachusetts.
As we attempt to study the broad subject of misconduct by the Department of Justice, we cannot overlook the one that is perhaps the most pervasive, and I'm stealing the word from Ramsey Clark, I think, most pervasive course of misconduct by the Department of Justice in the history of this country. Broader-based, long-standing, abuse of power beyond expression. Abuse of power through the use of federal agencies, including even the bankruptcy court. Throughout the days of the LaRouche ordeal of criminal charges, Odin Anderson, a lawyer from Boston, has been the solid rock of criminal defense and counsel far and above any other person. He can therefore speak to the subject of misconduct or such facets of that as he may choose to discuss better than anybody, with the possible exception of Lyndon and Helga. He has literally devoted a major portion of his life in the last 7 or 8 years to that, 8 or 9 years to that task. And we appreciate him taking the time to be here from Boston to make some such statement as he wishes to make and be responsive to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman, honorable panel. It's I who thank you for this opportunity to speak about the LaRouche case. I'm thankful as I looked up and counted names that there were only 11 of you, because if there had been a 12th, I would have been tempted to retry this case in front of you, assured, I think, that Mr. LaRouche would finally get a fair trial. I have represented Lyndon LaRouche since 1984, at which time he was directly targeted by the Department of Justice through its U.S. Attorney's Office in Boston. Although there is a history of many years prior to that. Back in the late 60s, you probably all remember a student organization called the Students for Democratic Society, the SDS, very active on campuses, particularly around the Vietnam War, but on many other issues of political importance to the United States, economic, social, broad range of issues. Mr. LaRouche and a number of political associates of his became involved in those very same issues, but they had a difficulty with SDS and essentially founded their own group, which became known originally as a faction of the SDS, the labor committees, but ultimately became known as the National Caucus of Labor Committees, which was and remains a political association of people who share like political views. Probably the best way to demonstrate the government's venal behavior and the unconstitutional activities undertaken directed out of the criminal division of the Department of Justice is to show you their own documents and read to you their own words. And by way of history, I'd like to have number 1 put up on the screen. What you see before you is an FBI memorandum from the SAC, who is the special agent in charge of the New York field office of the FBI, to the director. It's dated 1969.
March 69.
And it requests authorization of the director to issue a false leaflet to stir up antagonisms between these various aspects of SDS. Now, I'm sure that's a tactic familiar to all of you, if in slightly different form. They want to disseminate this leaflet under false cover to various of these groups and stir up as much controversy between them, there hopefully undermining their ability to act in concert and getting them into faction fights, which would destroy their efficiency and cohesion. Well, if you put up number 2, you'll see that they got that authority from the director of the FBI and his blessing. Authority is granted to anonymously mail copies of the leaflet submitted. Now, I'm not going to bother to show you the leaflet because it's a piece of scurrilous garbage. It's available for anyone who'd like to see it. It was called the Mousecrap Revolution, but its intent and purpose was exactly as defined in the letters. This is the Department of Justice. This is the FBI at work in the 1960s under, and if you look at the bottom, COINTELPRO, Counterintelligence Program. So in 1969 and 1970s, this was the kind of activity which was going on against the LaRouche political movement and many others, certain including people that you're well acquainted with personally. If we could move on to the next overlay. This is to the director, again from the SAC in New York, regarding, and the name subject, Lyndon Hermile LaRouche Jr., also known as Lynn Marcus, as they suggest. This is the most incredible piece of FBI material, one of the most incredible pieces of FBI material that I've ever seen. What this suggests is that the Communist Party has let the FBI know that they want to eliminate Lyndon LaRouche for their political reasons. They consider him to be a politically dangerous person, and the Communist Party wants to eliminate him. If you look at the bottom, New York proposes submitting a blind memorandum to the Daily World to foster these efforts. Here's the FBI climbing in bed with the Communist Party in order to effect the elimination of Lyndon LaRouche from the political scene. I think we all know what that means. And they go on to say that it's believed that once eliminated, the political effectiveness of the National Caucus of Labor Committees will thereby be diminished, and it will cease to be of any political significance. Here again is the FBI in the 70s in operation. Years went by, and the members of the National Caucus of Labor Committees continued their political efforts. Now, they are considered, Mr. LaRouche is considered extremely controversial by many. Those he's considered controversial by tend to be those whose policies are inconsistent with his, or those that he has named as being as operating against the best interests of the society and peoples of the United States. And we all know that those people tend to be very powerful people. Henry Kissinger, who we all know by name and some probably remember by reputation and actions, was a very powerful man. Mr. LaRouche took exception with his policies, which he considered to be genocidal, particularly in context with the financial policies and the conditionalities imposed on the Third World in order to get monies from the World Bank. Got into a serious row with Mr. Kissinger. And Mr. Kissinger writes to, on his letterhead, William Webster, the director of the FBI. They had recently had a lovely social occasion together at a place called the Grove, where these powers associate and frolic around in various curious ways. And after that, he thanks, he appreciates having seen him there, and asks for the assistance of Bill Webster in dealing with the LaRouche menace. Here is, within the short period thereafter, the Buck Revell, who was the head of counterintelligence for the FBI, I believe at the time, is sent this memorandum by William Webster, who was contacted by David Abshire of PIFIAB. That's the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. And these same parties, Henry Kissinger and his colleagues, are now raising before PIFIAB the question as to whether LaRouche is, because he seems to have funding from sources that they don't understand, is possibly operating as a foreign intelligence agent, and they want them to look into this. Now, what that does, and the words are bad enough, but the reality is terrifying. This triggers the executive order I referred to earlier, Executive Order 12333, which allows virtually any form of conduct, any activity, to be undertaken as long as it's under this national security cover. So this was the beginning of a national security covered operation against Mr. LaRouche and his colleagues. The common denominator between all of these cases is twofold. It's, as I said, political targeting, and it's the criminal division of the Justice Department. You probably also know from your own experiences with colleagues who have run afoul of the situations that have been discussed, that the first place they try is in the press. And then they try you in the courts once they've set the stage, once they've poisoned all the minds in the community against you. Then they haul you into court where you can't get a fair trial because the jurors who are sitting there have been told for days, months, years, or millennia what a bad person you are, what horrible offenses you've committed against the moral or social fabric of the community. Well, that's precisely what happened in the LaRouche case, probably more so than in any other case. In the LaRouche case, the press began not by accident, because the press, I mean, we all know who owns the press. It's not owned by individuals, and as a matter of fact, there's an awful lot of the ownership of the press which represents certain political and financial interests. All right. So the fact is that beginning in the same period of the 80s, a private financier in New York City named John Train, with reach into the media community by virtue of his social and financial circumstances, convened a group of media types in a salon that he hosted in his apartments to plan a press campaign against LaRouche and his political movement. And their objective was threefold: to tar and feather Lyndon LaRouche and his colleagues as best they could, to advocate and press for prosecutions of any kind in any place, and ultimately to destroy and jail LaRouche and destroy the political movement which he headed. Among those who attended this meeting, and there were several of them that we have evidence of collected over a period of years, and admissions by people under oath, were members of and as persons associated with the intelligence community, as well as people with political axes to grind against Mr. LaRouche, such as the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, who has historically done everything it could financially and editorially to label Mr. LaRouche as an anti-Semite, as a fascist, as a racist, as a Hitler, little Hitler, and some of the most scurrilous names we can imagine hurling in another person's face without basis. All of these parties collectively, and unfortunately this is the way these things operate, they don't operate above board, they operate under the table, where you can't see them because they don't flourish well in the light of day, but they grow well in darkness. They get together, and in fact, this has been referred to by others as part of the secret government, the powers that be that operate in conjunction with official agencies but are never seen or heard of. I want to move on briefly and specifically to the LaRouche cases, which are in fact a series of cases that began in 1984. In 1984, Mr. LaRouche, under his name, sued NBC and the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith in federal court in Alexandria, Virginia, on libel charges, basically on the basis of the accusations which I've already told you about. We tried that case. NBC lied through their teeth in terms of what information. We had, in fact, had FBI documents that indicated that the NBC reporter had received proprietary and non-public information from 4 agencies of the federal government with reference to Mr. LaRouche. So they give it to, they make the stories up and then they leak them out to people who want to use them against you. We sued NBC in Alexandria, Virginia. As soon as that case was over, NBC Boston, on the very day, as I had finished our presentation and was packing up, go back to Boston, NBC Boston published a so-called investigative series of theirs alleging that certain persons associated with the LaRouche political campaign had made false credit card charges against certain contributors. And they had a couple of contributors who got up and said, I met these people and I gave them $35, and the next thing I knew, there was $100 charged to my credit card. Well, I'll say one thing. Mr. LaRouche is very controversial, and people who contributed to them frequently came under various types of criticism for that contribution. Could be their wife who said, "What are you giving $100 away? We need to buy, new shoes for the kids." Or it could be a neighbor or a child, and many times the amounts of money were larger than that, so the reasons for opposing the contribution were even greater. But if you know anything about credit cards, the only way a person can recapture money charged to his credit card, which he has authorized, which has been charged to the account, is to say it was unauthorized. Those are the magic words. If you don't use the magic words, you can't collect the $100. So, in order to reverse a credit card charge, one must say, I never authorized it. Therefore, what you're alleging in that case, although the intent was probably not to make the allegation, but in fact you're alleging that the person did it without your authority, which could be a criminal act. Now, they started an investigation around this, which they conducted for 2 years. It ultimately culminated in a trial in Boston. Of course, another thing you'll all recognize from your personal experiences is that when they want to charge you when they don't have anything, they charge you with conspiracy, because then they don't have to prove anything. Then they just go around, tell a bunch of stories, and hope that the jury who's poisoned against you is going to link it up somehow and convict you. Right? So the conspiracy is the vehicle, and that's precisely what happened in Boston. LaRouche and his colleagues were charged with conspiracy, with a few other specific charges linked on as an afterthought. We tried the case for 7 months. We weren't even through with the government's case when the case mistried. The reason it mistried is that the jury had been led to believe that the case would have been over long before, which it would have had we been able to concentrate on the evidence. But because of the hearings that the judge was forced to conduct for literally months and months on governmental misconduct, the case dragged on and the jury sat in the jury box. So the jury ultimately got frustrated and wanted to go home, and the case mistried. This is an article from the Boston Herald that printed that day, and I'm only showing it to you for one reason, not because of the highlight, LaRouche jury would have voted not guilty, although that's true, and those come out of the words of the jury foreman who was interviewed. But in the first line of text, there are some very important words from the foreman. We would have acquitted everybody at this point, and that's based on prosecution evidence, said Foreman Dashowitz. There was too much question of government misconduct in what was happening to the LaRouche campaign. Government misconduct. Very seldom do you get a jury to see it because the government fights you nail and tooth. They lie, they cover up evidence, they in fact deny information to their own agents so that the agent won't be in the position to have to intentionally not disclose it. These are common tactics, and that's what happened here. Fortunately, in our case, we were able to show enough of it to the jury so that the jury got the smell. However, the government wasn't about to quit, particularly having taken what was a serious public relations beating at that point in time. So they decided to switch forums, come down to a much more favorable forum, the most favorable forum, the Eastern District of Virginia, the so-called Rocket Docket, the home of almost every government agency and government contractor in the country, with a few other pockets here and there. So they brought the case down there, indicted the case, and brought us to trial. New charges, new defendants. LaRouche was also indicted, so he was one of the few who was also charged the second time, and forced the case from indictment to trial in 28 days. There's a great book that's been, and it's not a novel. It's a factual book. It is the history of the case shown by the documents of the case, and it's called Railroad. And I commend it to your attention. I think copies, if you're interested in reading and see how that system worked in this particular case, it's all there, and it's not somebody else's words. It's the words from the court documents. In any event, LaRouche was convicted, as was all of his co-defendants, again on conspiracy charges. That was the seminal charge. The rest were just tacked on. This case, time it wasn't credit card. It was allegations of wire fraud. The allegation being that loans were taken from contributors without intent to repay, or with reckless disregard of the fact that payment wouldn't take place. Now, these were political loans made in the political context by political people to a political candidate in his political candidacy. Everybody knew that. Back in Boston, the grand jury that was investigating the case held certain businesses associated with Mr. LaRouche in contempt of court for not producing documents which were under subpoena, which were being fought during a period of time based on various privacy grounds. $20 million worth of contempt sanctions were imposed. The government then sought to collect that $20 million by filing an involuntary bankruptcy against these organizations in Alexandria, Virginia, just prior to not just prior, but some point prior to the Alexandria indictments. They also did this ex parte. They were the only creditor in violation of federal law. But by virtue of their ex parte petition to the judge, were able to effect the closing of these four businesses, all who engaged in First Amendment advocacy and publication. These businesses were closed. They were seized by federal marshals. They never reopened. The publications never reprinted. The $20 million the government sought was a ruse. In fact, what they intended to do and what they did do was close the conspiracy that they alleged in the Alexandria indictments on the very day that they filed the bankruptcy. The point of the bankruptcy being that from the moment a bankruptcy is filed, an order issues that no debts may be paid without permission of no one can pay any debts without order of the court. So it was physically impossible for any debts to be repaid after that, thereby creating a pool of persons who were owed money who couldn't be repaid. They got 5 or 6 of these people to come forward and say I was promised repayment and didn't get it, and that was the basis for the conviction for loan fraud. In any event, I want to say that we have fought as vigorously as anyone can through the appeals process without success, through the mandamus process, 2255s in federal court, and are now at a stage where Ramsey Clark, who has been with me, former Attorney General of the United States, who has been with me on all of the appeals, he joined the effort just after the sentencing of Mr. LaRouche and his colleagues in 1990. Recently, he wrote a letter to the Attorney General asking for a departmental review of the LaRouche case, and I'd like to read you some portions of his letter. He'll be here tomorrow to speak to you personally, but I'd like to leave you with the following words of Ramsey Clark. Dear Attorney General Reno, I've been an attorney in this case since shortly after the defendants were sentenced in January 1990 and appeared as counsel on appeal and on the subsequent motions and appeals in proceedings under 28 U.S. Code Section 2255 and Federal Rules Criminal Procedure Rule 33. I bring this matter to you directly because I believe it involves a broader range of deliberate and systematic misconduct and abuse of power over a longer period of time in an effort to destroy a political movement and leader than any other federal prosecution in my time or to my knowledge. 3 courts have now condemned the department's conduct in this prosecutorial campaign. The result has been a tragic miscarriage of justice, which at this time can only be corrected by an objective review and courageous action by the Department of Justice.
We've done some good things.
It might be slow, but it's coming.
The session will come to order. Session will come to order. We are pleased and honored to have with us today former Attorney General of the United States, Ramsey Clark, who will make such presentation as he may choose. General.
Thank you very much. It's a good feeling to be here with you again this year. I wish I could say it's been a good year for freedom and justice under law, but I can't say that. But at least in this company, you know that the struggle goes on and that we shall overcome. I will probably, unless my mind wanders, which it does, talk about 3 cases primarily. And I'll start and end with the case of Lyndon LaRouche and his co-defendants, not because it's the alpha and omega, although it's about as close as a case gets to the potential perfidy of justice, but because it shows how bad it can be, and yet it has, as so very, very few of these cases ever do, a positive side that we have to consider. I came into the case after the trial. As a person who lives in the country, and pays attention to these things, I followed it carefully. I knew something about the ways of the judicial district in which the case was filed and the meaning of filing a case there. To call it the rocket docket is a disservice unless you identify the rocket, because it's if there's a rocket in present use that would be similar, it would be the so-called depleted uranium-tipped missile, the silver bullet used in Iraq. In other words, it's a lethal rocket, not a rocket that sought truth or intended justice. I was prepared, therefore, for what might happen. I'd followed the earlier case in Boston, which by any measure was an extremely peculiar case, both in its charges and its prosecution and in its history. I knew the judge there as a fellow Texan. His brother, Page Keaton, had been dean of the law school where I started out down at the University of Texas. And he's one of the old school that doesn't like tricks, falsity, or injustice. And he became outraged with the prosecution. And did a lot. I can't tell you he did all that a judge could have done. I believe Odin will agree, though he did a lot. There are not many judges who come through a political conditioning and process who have the courage to stand up to the power of the executive branch, to the FBI and others, and say the things that he did. And that's was almost an early end to a malicious prosecution. But in what was as complex and pervasive a utilization of law enforcement, prosecution, media, and non-governmental organizations focused on destroying an enemy. This case must be number one. There are some where the government itself may have done more and more wrongfully over a period of time. But the very networking and combination of federal, state, and local agencies, of executive and even some legislative and judicial branches, of major media and minor local media, and of influential lobbyist types, the ADL preeminently. This case takes the prize. The purpose can only be seen as destroying. It's more than a political movement. It's more than a political figure. It is those two. But it's a fertile engine of ideas, a common purpose of thinking and studying and analyzing to solve problems regardless of the impact on the status quo or on vested interests. It was a deliberate purpose to destroy that at any cost. And yet all this law enforcement is coming down on them. We didn't have that violence you might say, that physical violence in the LaRouche case. But the potential from one side was entirely there. The day they went out to seize 2 million documents, as I recall, I may be off on the number, I think it's 2 million. Big warehouse, this is a lot of documents. These people produce a lot of paper, and it's not trash. I mean, it's not bureaucratic paper keeping, it's all, you may not agree with it, but it's saying things. They had several times more agents armed than the ATF force that initially attacked the Mount Carmel Church outside Waco on February 28, 1993. They just didn't have people on the other side who were shooters. I guess I'm really still caught with the idea, the old idea of the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States that is ingrained in a lot of Americans, and particularly young lawyers who are kind of idealistic and believe in the idea of freedom and the power of the word and the truth. I believe the truth can set us free. I really believe, I think that's the struggle. The real struggle is whether we can see the truth in time. The truth could set us free. In the LaRouche case, they're book people. I have to confess to the intellectual weakness. I find reading easier than thinking, so I read constantly, nearly blinded myself from too much reading. Got 15,000 books at home, read most of them, unfortunately. As you can tell, I haven't learned much, but I haven't stopped yet. These are book people. They had publishing houses going on, important publications, nonprofit stuff. The government comes in and these are just some of the peripheral things that Odin and others might not have explained to you. But these are what they were about: ideas, information, social change, meeting the needs of human people all over the world, humanity all over the world. We're going to have 1 billion more people before the end of this millennium, century, decade, and the vast majority, 80% or more, are going to have beautiful, darker skin, and they're going to live short lives of sickness, hunger, pain, ignorance, and violence unless we act radically. And these books have ideas. Some will work, some won't work, but they're ideas. They can be tested in the marketplace, as we used to say. And they come in with a bankruptcy claim, a false bankruptcy claim against nonprofit publishing houses and shut them down. What's the First Amendment worth, you know? We'll silence you. You'll have no books out there. And not only that, then they take people who were contributing and supposed to be paid back their loans to the publisher and try to prosecute falsely on it. They put on witnesses to give false testimony. From the tens and tens of thousands of contributors and the thousands of people who gave loans, they come up with a baker's dozen, roughly, 13, 14, 15 people who got their feelings hurt, perhaps, and some who were mean-spirited enough to lie about it, and who didn't get their money back, although they were being paid back, because anybody can have a financial crunch where you can't pay back. Imagine what would happen to political campaigns in this country if you enforced laws strictly against those who are raising money like this by inquiring about all the people who gave money, whether they got what they wanted, what they expected, and whether they were misled about it or anything else. Nobody could run for office. We know in this society that we are a plutocracy, that money dominates politics, absolutely dominates it. Read this new book, The Golden Rule, by Thomas Ferguson, University of Chicago Press, about the role of money in our democratic society, how it absolutely controls not just the elections and not just the politicians, but the whole shebang. The media, the military, the industry, everything. And you call it democracy. We need some ideas. We need the good words out there, and that's why it had to be stopped, and that's why they came after him. I read the record. In addition to reading books, I read lots of records from trials. Absolutely no evidence to support a conviction there. If you take it all, if you exclude the parts that were false or venomous, there's not even a shell. But they had to say that this noble enterprise, agree or not with it, was corrupt. Corrupt. Have nothing to do with it. It's corrupt. Nobody respects financial or other corruption. Destroy them that way. They were put to trial without any chance to prepare their case. And they made a valiant effort and got consecutive sentences. Unbelievable. We've been trying in every way we can, others much more than I, to make the LaRouche case known. I personally have appeared at meetings in Europe and North America. There have been books and pamphlets, and there's a constant flow of literature and verbal communication. We've tried for, I can't tell you how many years right now, but several years, maybe 4 even, to explore the possibility of fair hearings in the Congress. Hearings are risky in a highly political environment like that. There's a continuing effort. I think it will bear fruit. We've asked the Department of Justice for a comprehensive review. Lyndon LaRouche always asked for a review not only of his case, but of all cases where there are allegations of serious misconduct, and usually names a bunch of them. And so we've always done that. That's his vision. It happens to be my vision, too, of how you correct things. But the capacity of the Department of Justice for self-criticism is of a very low order. It has 2 offices that are charged with the responsibility. One's called the Office of Professional Responsibility, and one's called the Office of the Inspector General, and neither have ever done anything very serious I'm aware of. Maybe someone was caught stealing pencils or something, taking them home for the kids. That's about the dimension of their address. So our efforts to secure review of injustice, we've tried in the courts. I mean, we've sought habeas corpus, which is the grand English, it's the writ of amparo in the Dominican Republic. It's the grand old way of reviewing injustice and a wrongful conviction, and we got short shrift. We had to go back to the same judge who gave us the fast shrift the first time, the depleted uranium rocket docket. So we have to find solid means. The media is a great problem. The media is controlled by wealth and power that prefers the status quo, and it's very sophisticated in how it manages these matters. I can take a cause that they're interested in that's virtually meaningless and be on primetime evening news. and I can take on a cause of what I consider to be international importance of the highest magnitude that they oppose and shout from the rooftops, and you'd never know I existed. That's the way it works. So we've got to, that's one reason that, that the publications, the books and magazines and newspapers that spread the word, are, even though they're minor compared with the huge international media conglomerates that we're confronted with, but they reach thinking people, and they spread the word. I think we'll get our hearing in time, and I think it'll be a reasonably short time, but I think it's going to be meaningful. It's going to take a regeneration of moral force in the American people. I'm both an optimist and an idealist, so you have to take what I say with a grain of salt. But I believe that the civil rights movement was the noblest quest of the American people in my time. I think it was real and vital and passionate, and I think it consumed the energies and faith of some few millions of people. I mean, we really believed in it. We were marching and singing and doing. And then it kind of dribbled out. So that now we have these vicious fights that divide us. We have to have a moral regeneration and energy and commitment and faith and belief that we can overcome, that equality is desirable, that justice is essential, that a life of principle is the only life worth living. And then we'll get our hearings. Then we won't need our hearings, but we'll have to keep on.
All right, the session will come to order. If anyone needs an introduction to the next presenter, I suggest you see him after the meeting. We're delighted to have Lyndon LaRouche.
All right. Just for the record, I state a few facts which bear upon the circumstances in which certain events befell me. I was born in September 1922 in Rochester, New Hampshire, lived there for the first 10 years of my life, lived for the next 22 years of my life in Lynn, Massachusetts, except for service overseas. I moved to New York City, where I lived until July of 1983. And since that time, except for a period of incarceration, I have been a resident of the Commonwealth of Virginia. I attended university a couple of times during the course before the war, or at the beginning of the war and after it, and then had a career in management consulting, which lasted until about 1972, tapered off, sort of. My most notable professional achievement was developed during the years 1948, 1952, in certain discoveries of a fundamental scientific nature in respect to economics. And my professional qualifications are essentially derived from that. In the course of time, in 1964 approximately, I was persuaded that things were being done to change the United States, which, from my view, were the worst possible disaster which could befall this nation. And thus, while I had given up any hope of political improvement of this country before then to speak of, I felt I had to do something. So I became involved part-time from 1966 through 1973 in teaching a course, a one-semester course in economics, largely on the graduate level at a number of campus locations, chiefly in New York City, but also in Pennsylvania. In the course of this, a number of the students who participated in these classes became associated with me. And out of this association came the birth of a nascent political organization, as much a philosophical organization as political. Our essential commitment was third world issues and related issues, that is, the economic justice for what is called the third world, is essential for a just society for all nations. I became particularly attached to this during military service overseas in India, where I saw what colonialism does to people. And I was persuaded at the time, as I believe a majority of the people who were in service with me, was that we were coming to the end of a war which we had not foreseen, for which we had been obliged to fight, and that if we allowed these circumstances to prevail that I saw in the Third World, we would bring upon ourselves some kind of disaster, either war or something comparable down the line. And that was essentially our commitment as an association. We became rather unpopular with a number of institutions, including McGeorge Bundy's Ford Foundation. About 1969, we made a mess of a few projects he was funding by exposing them. And we also became unpopular with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, perhaps on the behest of McGeorge Bundy. In 1973, there was, according to a document later issued under the Freedom of Information Act by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the New York office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, acting at all times under supervision of Washington headquarters, hatched a plot to have me eliminated or to induce the Communist Party USA that my elimination would solve a number of their problems. There actually was an abortive attempt on me during that period. And later, of course, I knew the FBI had been involved. I couldn't prove it then, but I knew it. And later a document appeared showing that. From that point on, during the 1970s, until the end of COINTELPRO, we were constantly beset by the FBI. Our main weapon against the FBI was jokes. We used to make some jokes about the FBI, which we would pass around to try to persuade them to keep off our tail, but they kept coming, and all kinds of harassment. Then in 1982, there was a new development. I sensed it happening, but I received the documents later. The events which led to my, what I would call a fraudulently obtained indictment and conviction and incarceration. It started, according to the record, of which I had some sensibility this was going on at the time, of Henry Kissinger, the former Secretary of State, with whom no love was lost between us, went to William Webster and others soliciting an FBI or other government operation against me and my associates. This led, as the record later showed, to a decision by Henry Kissinger's friends on the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board recommending an operation against me and my associates. This was adopted during the same month of January by Judge Webster, the director of the FBI, who passed the implementation of this instruction along to his subordinate, Oliver Buck Revell, recently retired from the FBI, I believe. And the first inkling I had of this was in about April of 1983, at which time a New York banker, who is very intelligence-witting, shall we say, a private bank of Smith and Train in New York City, held a salon at which various government agents, private individuals, the Anti-Defamation League, for example, and also NBC TV News, the Reader's Digest, the Wall Street Journal, and others were represented. The purpose was to coordinate an array of libels, a menu of libels, which would be commonly used by the news media in an attempt to defame me and hopefully, from their standpoint, to lead to criminal action against me and my associates. In January of 1984, this attack came into the open, launched by NBC TV, which had been a participant in this salon of trains, which launched the pattern, which was the pattern of coverage by all U.S. news media, major news media, and many minor news media, from the period of January, the end of January 1984, through the end of 1988. I saw no case of any significant coverage of me or mention of me in the U.S. print media, particularly the major print media, the Associated Press in particular, which was an active part of the prosecution, in fact, or in the national television media, network media especially. Not a single mention of me which did not conform to the menu of libels concocted by this salon, which had been established under John Train as part of this operation. This salon, including the Anti-Defamation League, NBC, TV, others, the Associated Press, actively collaborated, beginning sometime in 1984, with forces inside the government which were determined to have a criminal prosecution against me and my associates. The criminal prosecution was launched in about the time of the election, the 1984 presidential election, in October, November 1984. And from that point on, it was a continued escalation until a federal case in Boston led to a mistrial, occasioned largely by government misconduct in the case, in May of 1988. Following that, in about October, was it 14th or something of that sort, in Virginia, a new prosecution was opened up, and that led to my conviction in December of 1988 and my sentencing for 15 years in 1989. I believe Mr. Anderson has described the nature of the case. And that resulted in 5 years of service in federal prison, which I'm now released on parole. The motivations of the case against us, I think, are in part obvious, perhaps partly not. In 1982-83, there were two things which greatly excited my enemies. Number one, I had been involved in 1982 in presenting a proposal which is based on my forecast in the spring of 1982 that a major debt crisis would break out in South America, Central America, and the expectation that Mexico would be the nation that would have a debt crisis. I've been involved with many of these countries and personalities in them in projecting alternatives to this kind of inequitable system where colonial nation had been replaced as a term by debtor nation. And the debt of South America, Central America, was largely illegitimate, that it was a debt which had not been incurred for value received, but had been done under special monetary conditions under the so-called floating exchange rate system, where somebody would come, bankers would come to a country, the IMF in particular, and say, we just wrote down the value of the currency, we're now going to refund your financing of your foreign debt, which you can no longer pay on the same basis as before. So I propose that the debt crisis be used as the occasion for united action by a number of governments of South and Central American countries to force a reform in the international debt relations and to force a reform within international monetary relations. This report was entitled Operation Juarez, largely because of the relationship of President Lincoln to Mexico during the time that Lincoln was president, with the idea that it was in the interest of the United States to accept and to sponsor such a reform, to assist these countries in the freedom to resume development of the type which they had desired. And this report was published in August of 1982, ironically a few weeks before the eruption of the great Mexico debt crisis of '82, and was presented also to the U.S. government, the National Security Council, for the President's information at that time. There was some effort on the part of the President of Mexico to implement my proposal in the initial period of the debt crisis. He had at that time some support from the President of Brazil and the government of Argentina. But under pressure from the United States, the government of Brazil and Argentina capitulated, and President Jose Lopez Portillo, the President of Mexico, was left, shall we say, hanging out to dry. As a result, in October of 1982, he capitulated to the terms which were delivered to his government and people around him by people such as Henry A. Kissinger, who made a trip to Mexico at that time to attempt to intimidate the Mexicans to submitting to these new terms. This was one issue between me and Kissinger and his friends. The second issue was that sometime about December of 1981, a representative of the U.S. government approached me and had asked me if I would be willing to set up an exploratory back-channel discussion with the Soviet government, because the Soviet government wanted, according to them, an additional channel to discuss things. And I said didn't reject the idea. I said, but I have an idea on this question of nuclear missile. It was becoming increasingly dangerous, forward basing, more precise missiles, electromagnetic pulse. We're getting toward a first strike. It would be very useful to discuss what I proposed in my 1980 election campaign with the Soviet government to see if they'd be interested in discussing such a proposal. This might prove a profitable exploratory discussion. And so from February of 1982 through February 1982, I did conduct such back-channel discussions with representatives of the Soviet government in Washington, D.C. Those were somewhat fruitful, but ultimately abortive. Kissinger and others became aware of this discussion during the summer of 1982, and their circles were very much opposed to that. The general view was expressed, but that I was getting too big for my britches, and I had to be dealt with. On the question of debt, which some of these people were concerned about, and on this question of strategic missile defense, which I had this proposal which the President adopted, at least initially, in the form of what became known as the Strategic Defense Initiative. And when the Strategic Defense Initiative was announced by the President on March 23rd, 1983, there were a lot of people out for my scalp. Those are the at least contributing factors in what happened to me. But they may not be all. There probably are others as well. We have, in my view, a system of injustice whose center is within the Department of Justice, especially the criminal division of the U.S. Department of Justice. The problem lies not with one administration or another, though one administration or another may act more positively or more negatively. You have permanent civil service employees, like Deputy Assistant Attorneys General Jack Keeney and Mark Richard, who are coordinators of a nest of institutions in the criminal division, which show up repeatedly as leading or key associates of every legal atrocity which I've seen. This is the case with the so-called Frumention operation, which is largely an FBI operation, but cannot run without cooperation from these people. We have an out-of-control Justice Department, in my view, where the rot is not in the appointees as much as it is in the permanent bureaucracy. We have a permanent sickness in the permanent bureaucracy of part of our government. In my case, when the time came that somebody wanted me out of the way, they were able to rely upon that permanent injustice in the permanent bureaucracy of government to do the job. As in the Frumention case, the Weaver case, the Waco case, the case of Waldheim, the case of Demoniak, and other cases, always there's that agency inside the Justice Department which works for contract like a hitman when somebody with the right credentials and passwords walks in and says, we want to get this group of people or we want to get this person. My case may be, as Ramsey Clark described it, the most extensive and the highest level of these cases in terms of the duration and scope of the operation. So my case is important in the sense it's more extensive, it's more deep-going, long-going. But when it came to getting me, it was the same apparatus that I find, in my opinion, was used in these other cases. And that until we remove from our system of government a rotten, permanent bureaucracy which acts like contract assassins, using the authority of the justice system to perpetrate assassination, this country is not free, nor anyone in it. That's my view of the matter. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anything you ask me, of course.
you and I had a little chat in Selma, Alabama. I guess you can understand that even somebody like me sometimes feel overwhelmed. And whether or not America is just a lost cause. I hate to sound that way, but after 40 years, I got serious reservations about whether we can save this country, about whether this country even wants to be saved.
Well, I take an evangelical view of this. I've been associated with many lost causes in my life, as you have.
Yeah.
And once in a while we win them. The problem with people, as I see it, is people don't trust the leadership, and I don't blame them for not trusting their leadership. I blame them for being too pessimistic. And it's up to us and others to get enough people moving to create a movement. Like the case just of Martin Luther King. Now, I never personally met Martin Luther King, but I watched him closely. And I know something about Martin Luther King from people who knew him and his circumstances. And here's a man who was a good man, he's a preacher, Baptist preacher, I don't know, they run to this way and that way. But one day somebody appointed him, nominated him to be a leader of the civil rights movement, out of a crowd, so to speak. He took the job as an appointee, like a federal appointee, only this was the civil rights movement. He went from crisis to crisis in a few years from the time that he received that appointment until he went to his death, knowing he was facing death. And in that period of time, he made a number of public speeches of great power and pith. Each of those speeches corresponded to a point of crisis in the history of the civil rights movement. And I saw on television, and I read in the recorded speeches, I read a man who had gone into his own Gethsemane, probably inspired by reading the New Testament, and said, I will drink of this cup. And he came out with an idea, with a lot of people swarming around him. But he came out with the idea, and he presented a concept which took a whole people who were looking to him in the civil rights movement, and he ennobled them. He said, you're not fighting for African American rights, you're fighting for everybody's rights. You're fighting to make the Constitution real. And it was a new idea, a different idea. And as he did with his mountain speech that he gave just before he went, again, a man who had walked into Gethsemane and said, yes, Lord, I will drink of this cup as my Savior before me. And he went out and he drank of the cup, and he inspired people. Now, we don't know who among us is going to be the great leader of this period. But we know, as the civil rights people of the 1960s who had been in the civil rights business for many centuries, in point of fact, many of them of the conscious family tradition, they assembled together. They picked people from their midst as leaders. And among these leaders was Martin Luther King. And I think if enough of us assemble today around these kinds of issues and show the nation that there is something moving, something which is of concern to the average citizen, that from among those we gather, together for that purpose, we will find the leaders we need.